So, a very good afternoon to all of you present here. I, Dr. Krishna Sinhamahapatra, welcome you back to a new lecture series on the topic literary criticism. So, all my dear friends and students who have been there with me in the previous lecture series already know the topics which we have already discussed. So, we have kind of discussed the main idea of what literature is and how literary theory is a kind of a body of the theories which empowers us to see literature in a different way through their own kind of lens, be it the lens of feminism, be it the lens of post-colonialism, which we have discussed. So there are different kinds and ways of reading and rereading literature based on the different theories. Yes. Good afternoon, Satish. Hello. So today we are going to start a whole new series on literary criticism, which is there for your NET set English examination and is also an important area to read. So our lecture 1 today will be an introduction to the idea of literary criticism. What are the different literary criticisms which we are going to read, how they are going to be important, because as we were discussing literary theory in the previous lecture series, we discussed that literary theory actually originated or it evolved from the idea of literary criticism. Right. So that is what our lecture 1 in this series will be about. Now, the term literary criticism consists of two words, as you can see. One is literary and the other word is criticism. Now, can you tell me what comes to your mind when I say criticism? Usually what comes to our mind when we are saying criticism? Would anybody like to tell me something? I can see a few of you are online. I can see Satish, his comment in the chat box. So, anybody would like to tell me what comes to your mind when we say criticism? What do we mean by that? Okay. So, usually, for example, when we go out, we have gone for a party, or we have gone to a marriage ceremony, right? And we see different people and we see different things happening there. After returning, what we do, we start discussing about them. We share comments about them. We sometimes say something good, sometimes say something bad about something. So that is what is, the origin of the idea of criticism. So criticism originates from observing things, people, crowd around you, seeing them, talking to people, critiquing them. And when we are saying critiquing or criticism, it is about the positive as well as the negative aspect of different things. So literary criticism is basically, a tool for what? For analyzing and evaluating things, right? So this is what criticism is about. And the term, as you can see, is literary criticism. So literary criticism means what we are. Okay, so very good. Sanjay Kumar has given the answer, a judgment. So definitely we can talk about, or we can, say that, literary criticism is about judgment. We are judging something. We are kind of critiquing something, observing that and analyzing its positive and negative aspects, right? So when we are saying literary criticism, then it is the way we are critiquing different aspects of literature. So if theory is the body of, things which we need to consider while critiquing something, then criticism is actual practical application of the different theories in analyzing different bodies of literature. So when we are analyzing and evaluating different kind and bodies of literature, what usually literary criticism covers is either the analyzing or evaluating of some poets and writers in general, or specific texts, writers or works, or particular literary genre. That is it, either about the poetry, about drama, or about prose. So literary criticism in that way is basically the way of critiquing or analyzing or judging or evaluating different bodies of literature, right? So the idea of literary criticism originated with the Greek critics. So this is where the origin of literary criticism lies. So it's from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle that criticism originated. It started. It kept on evolving, it took different forms, and it is still evolving with new movements, new things. And whenever we are applying a theory to analyze a text, we are actually critiquing that text with our knowledge or base and understanding of a particular theory. But the idea of critiquing any literary theory, being a critic of that, started with the Greek critics, that is Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Then we can refer to the Roman critics. When we are saying Roman critics, it's Horace, Longinus, Quintilian. Then came the significant figure of the Middle Age critics, that is Philip Sidney. And then we came to the Enlightenment age critics, and basically John Dryden, who is called the father of English criticism, he started. And then there is contribution of Alexander Pope. Then there is the contribution of Samuel Johnson. And we see that all these writers whom we are talking about as critics, they are also creators of literature. So, am I audible now? Is it clear? Okay. So, thank you so much for bearing with us. We had this technical problem at BARTI office, because of which we were not able to have the lecture as we had expected. However, now the things have been resolved. So, be with us. So, we were discussing then what is literary criticism. We discussed the different ages, how literary criticism started, and then through the ages how it evolved. Finally, we were discussing about literary criticism in the Victorian age. And then, as we were saying, that with the modern age, what happened is that slowly, after post World War, as we are discussing, that literary theory came to place. However, this literary theory, which we have discussed in the previous lecture series, has its origin in literary criticism. And as a result, literary criticism and understanding of literary criticism is important. And again, we can also say that, whenever we are doing a piece of criticism based on the theories which we have learned in our literary theory lectures, then it's actually a practical application of literary theory, a literary theory based criticism of the different works of literature, which can be termed as, the idea of criticism. So, literary criticism refers to the reasoned consideration of literary works and issues. So, reasoned in the sense we are doing a kind of, informed consideration, informed reading, an informed kind of investigation of or analysis of what? Of literary works and issues. So, certain literary works and the issues which are there in those works, right? It applies as a term to any argumentation about literature, whether or not specific works are analyzed. So, whether any specific work is analyzed or not is a different thing. So here we can talk about Arnold, who does study of poetry and touchstone method, and identify certain of such works which are, can be applicable as very good pieces of literature. But otherwise also we can talk about poetry in general, we can talk about prose in general, about literature in general, poets in general, and make an argumentation about that. So about literature, about the different writers, about the way literature is approached. So a very reasoned consideration, a very reasoned argumentation based on these topics can be termed as literary criticism. If we are talking about literary criticism in Indian culture, because in net set you do get questions from Indian literary criticism and the idea of rasa theory, and what do we mean by Natya Shastra? So the Sanskrit Natya Shastra includes literary criticism on ancient Indian literature and Sanskrit drama. So the Sanskrit Natya Shastra is the origin of Indian literary criticism on ancient literature and Sanskrit drama. So Natya Shastra, Natya in the sense, brings in the concept of dance, the concept of drama. So Natya Shastra is notable as an ancient encyclopedic treatise on the arts, one which has influenced dance, music, and different aspects of creativity. So Natya Shastra is notable as an ancient encyclopedic treatise on arts, one of the which has influenced dance, music, literary traditions in India. It is also notable for its aesthetic rasa theory. So what is the rasa theory? What is the Indian rasa theory is something which we need to consider, which asserts that entertainment is a desired effect of performance. So it's a desired effect of what? Of performance, arts, but not the primary goal. That the primary goal is to transport the individual in the audience into another parallel reality full of wonder, where they experience the essence of their own consciousness and reflect on spiritual and moral questions. So according to the Indian Natya Shastra, what happens is that, the idea of literary criticism, Indian literary criticism takes its origin from here. And herein, what is being said is that the basic and entertainment which we are getting out of a piece of literature, out of a piece of art, out of a kind of a performance like dance, is not the ultimate aim. The ultimate aim is to transport whom the individual in the audience into another parallel reality. So another parallel reality full of wonder, which is full of wonder, where they experience, what do they experience? They experience the essence of their own consciousness and reflect on spiritual and moral questions. So this is the main idea of literary criticism if we talk about literary criticism with Indian origin. So we have kind of discussed the different aspects of literary criticism and also the origin of literary criticism in Indian studies. And now we are getting into the discussion of the very first, literary criticism, which is the Greek critics. And if we are talking about the Greek critics, then Socrates kind of initiated the process. So Socrates was a Greek philosopher from Athens who is credited as the founder of Western philosophy and among the first moral philosophers. So among the first moral philosophers of the ethical tradition of thought. So Socrates was a Greek philosopher from Athens who is credited as the founder of Western philosophy and among the first moral philosophers of the ethical tradition of thought. Ethical in the sense what is right and what is wrong, how to follow the correct path. So he is the first moral philosopher and he is initiated the ethical tradition of thought. Then, as an enigmatic figure, Socrates authored no texts and is known mainly through the posthumous accounts. Posthumous means when he was dead, the accounts of classical writers, particularly his students Plato and Xenophon. So, though he has not written any books, but we get to know about him through the things which have been written by their students, published by their students later on. So these accounts are written as dialogues in which Socrates and his interlocutors examine a subject in the style of question and answer. They gave rise to the Socratic dialogue literary genre. So the later accounts have been written in the form of dialogues as if they are having a dialogue, that is a discussion between Socrates and his interlocutor. So two people are discussing. So this is how the dialogues are written. So Socrates gave birth to this whole concept of, Western, or is the founder rather of the Western philosophy and is among the first moral philosophers of the ethical tradition of thought. Contradictory accounts of Socrates make a reconstruction of his philosophy nearly impossible, a situation known as Socratic problem. So what is the Socratic problem? The fact that contradictory accounts of Socrates are available, and as a result making a reconstruction of his thoughts or philosophy completely is definitely a problematic, because he himself has not written anything. It is after he is, he died, and after that his students who were, through their creations, we get to know about Socrates. As a result, the entire analysis of his body of knowledge has not reached us. Socrates was a polarizing figure in Athenian society, the society where he was living. In 399 BC, he was accused of impiety and corrupting the youth. And hence, after a trial that lasted a day, he was sentenced to death. So since he was sentenced to death, he didn't have that kind of time to write or to kind of put his works in place before he left this world. And And then, as a bright student of Socrates, we get Plato and his works, which are very, very significant, and they lay base to the idea of literary criticism, and hence it is laying base to the idea of literary theory as well, which has evolved from the idea of literary criticism. So, although almost all of the criticism ever written dates back from the 20th century, questions first posed by Plato and Aristotle are still of prime concern. So, though a lot of development has happened in the field of literary criticism and literary theory, yet the contribution of Plato and Aristotle is definitely of a lot of concern. It is still something which is kind of, it has got a lot of weightage, and hence going back to them and understanding their philosophy is important. So every critic who has attempted to justify the social value of literature has had to come to terms with the opposing argument made by Plato in the Republic. The poet as a man and poetry as a form of statement both seemed untrustworthy to Plato, who depicted the physical world as an imperfect copy of transcendent ideas and poetry as a mere copy of the copy. So, poetry is what? Poetry is the copy of the copy. So, not just a copy, but copy of the copy. So, what happens is that for Plato, the poet as a man and poetry as a form of statement both seemed untrustworthy. He couldn't trust these ideas. And his idea was that he depicted that the physical world is an imperfect copy of transcendent ideas and poetry is a mere copy of the copy. Thus, according to Plato, literature could only mislead the seeker of truth. So, instead of leading to some successful end, according to Plato, literature could only mislead the seeker of truth. So, Plato credited the poet with divine inspiration. So, what did Plato credit the poet with? Plato credited the poet with divine inspiration. But this too was cause for worry. A man possessed by such madness would subvert the interests of a rational polity. Poets were therefore to be banished from the hypothetical republic. So, according to Plato, the poets and the action of poetry was not something authentic. Literature could only mislead the seeker of truth. So, literature, according to Plato, could not provide any essence of truth. And the poet who was having some kind of divine inspiration was also a cause for worry, because that kind of man who had this kind of divine inspiration, according to Plato, would not be able to provide any rational thought process. This is the reason why Plato felt that, the poets need to be banished, that is put away, thrown away from the hypothetical, that is the kind of imaginary republic which he envisions or dreams of, right? So, according to Plato, literature and poets are not to be believed, and they are to be thrown away or banished from the hypothetical republic which he dreams of. In Athens, Plato founded the academy. What is the academy? A philosophical school where he taught the philosophical doctrines that would later become known as Platonism. So he was teaching philosophical doctrines, in his philosophical school, which was named Academy, which would later become known as what? Known as Platonism, right? So Plato never speaks in his own voice in his dialogues. Every dialogue except the laws features Socrates. Although many dialogues, including the timers and statesmen, feature him speaking only rarely. So, Plato's dialogues are very famous. And as we are saying that dialogue except the laws features whom? Features Socrates. And Socrates is having dialogue with another interlocutor in those dialogues. Right? And through that dialogue or through those discussions, what evolves is the idea of literature. Now, although Socrates influenced Plato directly, the influence of Pythagoras, or in a broader sense, the Pythagoreans, such as Archytas, also appears to have been significant. So, Socrates influenced Plato directly because he was a student. However, the influence of Pythagoras and the people who kind of took that forward was also significant in Plato's dialogues. Two of Plato's works may be termed as seminal critics of life and society, that is the dialogues. So, you need to know what is there in the dialogues. If there is a question from the dialogues, you should be able to answer that. Conversations between Plato and his teacher Socrates, and the Republic, wherein he gives this kind of idea of what would an ideal republic look like. So this is what he talks about in the Republic. And the dialogues, as we are seeing, they're discussing about different subjects, and the discussion is between Plato and his teacher Socrates. So according to Plato, writing should be didactic. It should instruct the reader citizen of the aristocracy on what to do and what not to do. So according to Plato, literature should be didactic. What is didactic? That is to instruct the reader or citizen of the aristocracy on what to do and what not to do. Through writings, the writer cum philosopher should also offer tips to the king on how to contribute as a ruler for the welfare of the society. So the first point is referring to his different works. Then the fact that he thinks that writing should be didactic. And then that through writings, a writer come philosopher. So the writer come philosopher. Writer or a philosopher. So the writer should be a philosopher who is providing philosophy, which is lifelike, which is true, which is to be followed, which is didactic. That is, which is going to instruct the readers and the citizens of the country on what to do and what not to do in the real sense of the term. So through writings, the writer come philosopher should also offer what? Tips to the king on how to contribute as a ruler for the welfare of society. So through writings, the writer come philosopher should also offer tips to the king on how to contribute as a ruler for the welfare of society. So whenever they are instructing, they should instruct about things which are going to bring about something positive. For example, the welfare of society. So literature is not only going to instruct the people in general, but also the king how to take care of the society and create welfare society. This consequently leads to the development of a good society or republic. So the ultimate aim of a poet should be, the ultimate of a writer should be that he or she should contribute. Contribute towards what? Contribute towards the development of a good society or republic. Art, according to Plato, feeds and waters the passions. It is divine madness. This is with reference to poetry that deals with myths and stories. So, the expectation which Plato has is that the idea of poetry or poetry should actually help in development of a good society or republic. However, according to Plato, art is not doing that job. Instead of doing that job, what is it doing? Art, according to Plato, is feeding and watering the passion of human beings, and it is divine madness. So he is terming it as divine madness. This is with reference to poetry that deals with what? With myths and stories. So he is stating that the poetry is divine madness, because it deals with what? It deals with myths and stories. Both myth and story is not true to being real. It is not didactic. It is watering the passion. It is divine madness, and it is not doing justice to the didactic role of literature. Then comes the idea of mimesis. So, mimesis in Greek thought primarily meant making of one sort or another. This is well recorded in Plato. Plato gave a new metaphysical and epistemological perspective to mimesis, enlarging its meaning from making by human hands to making by universal force. So the difference is that mimesis is about making, but not just making by human hands, but making by universal force. Yet mimesis, not only in Plato's definition, but in the use of the concept in the whole of Western tradition, always retain the same sense of not only making, but of making a copy of some original which was never totally independent of the model. So there is always this idea of making a copy of some original which was never totally independent of the model. So in Platonic theory, all art or technique has been taken to mean some kind of manipulation. So some kind of manipulation close to craft. So it's the idea of mimesis is always there. Mimesis in the sense of kind of manipulation, kind of imitation of something which is already there. Then the lower status of art which Plato provides, why does he do that? So Plato postulates that sometimes mimesis is an accurate reproduction of the original. So what is mimesis? Mimesis is an accurate reproduction of the original with all the properties to produce a genuine likeness. What is genuine likeness? Icon. At other times, mimesis may be a semblance, that is a phantasma. So, Plato postulates that sometimes mimesis is an accurate reproduction of the original with all the properties to produce a genuine likeness. So, when it is exactly like the original product or the original thing which it is imitating, then that genuine likeness is termed as icon. And at other times, mimesis may be a semblance, which is just a resemblance, not exactly like the original, which is termed as phantasma. So, icon and phantasma can be the two outcomes of mimesis, wherein one mimesis is an accurate reproduction of the origin, while the other is producing a genuine, the other one is producing a semblance. So first one, a genuine likeness, which is icon, and the second one is a semblance, which is phantasma. So phantasma is a false representation, and the poets and painters, according to Plato, are adept in doing this. So according to Plato, mostly what the poets do is that the poets kind of indulge in this kind of mimesis, which is mainly about a semblance, that is phantasma, and that is what makes Plato kind of unhappy with the poets, and hence he, in his tract called Phaedrus, Plato gives them a lower status, and them is actually referring to the lower status of art. Why he provides or gives art a lower status? So it is because art is a copy, and it is a copy which is just a semblance but not a complete original copy of the original, which makes Plato give them a lower status. In the Platonic scheme, the way to knowledge was not inspirational but investigative. So according to him, knowledge or the way to knowledge is not inspirational but investigative. One had to reject falsehoods, misconceptions, and popular notions one by one to arrive at the essence of the object of inquiry. So what one had to do, had to reject falsehoods, misconceptions, and popular notions one by one to arrive at the essence of the object of inquiry. So, to understand the essence or the real value of the object of inquiry, one had to reject falsehoods, misconceptions, and popular notions. In the essence lies the reflection of the form of an object or thing. So the idea is, in the essence lies a reflection of the form of an object or thing. The form alone is real as it is unchanging. All changing things can be a basis for opinions but not knowledge or episteme. So he's saying that all things which are changing, they can be basis for opinions but not knowledge. So these are the views of Plato. Now, whenever we are discussing Plato, the parable of the cave is associated with his theory. What happens here? So, the parable or the tale of the cave. So, the parable of the cave mentioned by Plato is one of the most important contributions made to philosophy. And it occurs where? It occurs in his The Republic, and is attributed to whom? To Socrates, his teacher. So now what happens? A man is in a cave and it is pitch dark. So it's very dark inside the cave. There are things in the cave and he feels the presence of those things. He sees their shadows but is unable to see them clearly. So he is able to see their shadows but he is unable to see them clearly. Based on these shadows, he describes the things that he sees. So how is he seeing the things? He is seeing the things through shadows. So now my question would be that if for example, how many of you have seen shadows? I think everyone. We have seen shadows of ourselves. We have seen shadows of different objects, right? So shadow is not something very uncommon. All of us know what is a shadow. So if I ask you, does a shadow and a real object look same? Do they look same or they look different? Yes? So all of you will agree on the fact that when we are referring to a shadow, the shadow doesn't actually look like the original. However, we can make out or make some idea about the original based on the shadows, right? So this is what he's actually doing, that based on these shadows, he is describing the things that he sees. So philosophy is the light that dispels the darkness and displays reality. So what is philosophy? Philosophy is that which dispels the darkness and displays reality. So this brings us to the three-tier structure, that is the ideal or the perfect, that is comprehended by philosophy, the real, that is an imitation of the ideal, and the mimetic, that is an imitation of the real. So these are the three layers of understanding a truth which happens when somebody is kind of creating some art or some piece of literature. So first truth is the truth of the ideal or the perfect kind, that is comprehended or is given by philosophy. Then comes the real aspect or the real part, that is what? That is an imitation of the ideal. And then the mimetic. When we are saying mimesis in itself talks about imitation, and imitation of the real. So art is twice removed from reality. So how does it happen? For instance, the original, that is the ideal tree, is the first of its kind. So what is the first of its kind? The first is the original. The ideal tree is the first of its kind. This makes way to what? It makes way to all others. All other trees. So we can see so many other trees, right, in this picture. So all other trees are basically an imitation of this particular tree, which is the original idea, right? So it's an imitation of this. And the artist's painting, so this painting of the tree, as we can see, or the poet's description. So if a poet describes the tree with the description that it has a trunk which is brown in color, then it has branches and leaves of different shades of green covering the branches, then what it is doing is that it is actually creating an imitation of the real trees. So first is the ideal tree, or the ideal any object, if we take for that matter, ideal stage, and then we move on to the real stage wherein you are actually seeing that thing, and then comes the mimetic stage wherein there is a mimesis or imitation of the real tree, which is again the imitation of the ideal tree. So art is twice removed from reality. If this is art, the mimetic action taking place is the art, then it is twice removed from reality. So in Plato's Republic, we kind of see this kind of discussion. So the artist has neither knowledge nor correct opinion about the goodness or badness of the things he represents. So the artist, what happens, has no knowledge, neither any correct opinion about the goodness or the badness of the things he represents. Apparently not. So the poet too, as an artist, will be pretty ignorant. So the poet will also be pretty ignorant about the subjects of his poetry. So the poet is also an artist and will be pretty ignorant about the subjects of his poetry, because he is only ignorant, and how can he create some informed reading or a kind of informed kind of discussion, right? Because he himself is not really kind of informed. So he is not only ignorant but completely ignorant. But he will still, what will happen? He will still go on writing poetry in spite of his ignorance of all he writes about, and will represent anything that pleases ignorant multitude. So in this process, even though he is ignorant, he will constantly keep on writing. And the things which he is going to produce, those things are not going to be original or authentic, because he himself is ignorant, and rather completely ignorant. And this ignorance will not result in any kind of fruitful poetry. What else can he do? Well, I conclude we seem to be pretty well agreed that the artist knows little or nothing about the subjects he represents, and that his art is something that has no serious value. So we were discussing that he gives the status which he gives to the poetry is not really good, and the reason is that the art which is created by the poets or the artists doesn't have real value. They don't have any serious value, and that this applies to all tragic poetry, epic and dramatic. Yes, entirely agreed. So the idea is that any piece of literature, be it the tragic poetry, epic or dramatic, they do not carry any serious value, because the artist himself doesn't know anything. He knows little or nothing about the subjects which he is representing, and as a result, the art which he is creating also doesn't have any serious value. Now this brings us to Aristotle. So Aristotle is again a very, very important figure in the world of criticism, and he comes his works are kind of have created the start of the whole world of literary criticism. So in his Poetics, still the most respected of all discussions of literature, Aristotle countered Plato's indictment by stressing what is normal and useful about literary art. So, though Plato was banishing the poets from his Republic, we see that Aristotle is kind of countering, that is, going against of what Plato wanted to say in his way of, or in his process of talking about criticism. So the tragic poet is not so much divinely inspired as he is motivated by a universal human need to imitate, and what he imitates is not something like a bed, Plato's example, but a noble action. So Aristotle says that what a poet is imitating is not just an object like bed, which Plato's, is the example of Plato. Rather, he is imitating a noble action. And it is because of this reason that, according to Aristotle, we need to give importance to the idea of poetry. Such imitation presumably has a civilizing value for those who empathize with it. So what does Aristotle do? Aristotle identifies a kind of, important value which any piece of literature gives, and the value is that it provides a civilizing value. So this imitation, the imitation which is there in the process of creating a work of art, has a civilizing value for whom? For those who empathize with it. That is, who put themselves in that position and feel for that particular object. So tragedy does arouse emotions of pity and terror. So these emotions are important, and you can get questions on them, that it arouses the emotions of what? Of pity and terror in its audience. But these emotions are purged. So these emotions are purged out, and that process is called catharsis. Sometimes we are using catharsis. So catharsis is the process of purging out of emotions in the form of pity and terror, which is aroused in the audience's mind when an audience is watching a particular tragedy. So Aristotle succeeded in portraying literature as satisfying and regulating human passions instead of inflaming them. So this is where Aristotle goes against Plato, and he questions and he gives answers to the fact that what use literature has, and he states that literature is actually kind of giving us or satisfying, regulating human passions instead of inflaming them. So inflame, we are not doing inflaming them, but rather we are satisfying and regulating the human passions, right? So this is what Aristotle does, and he goes against the idea of Plato. Now we have the next few points, which is about his philosophy, his concepts, his ideas of criticism. That is, Aristotle's practical contribution to criticism as opposed to his ethical defense of literature lies in his inductive treatment of the elements and kinds of poetry. So, where does it lie? It lies in the inductive treatment of the it talks about the elements of other kinds of poetry. So poetic modes are identified according to their means of imitation. So what is it kind of identifying? It is identifying the poetic modes through the means of imitation, the actions they imitate, the manner of imitation, and its effects. So what do poetic modes do? The poetic modes are actually identified according to their means of imitation, the actions they imitate, the manner of imitation, and its effects. These distinctions assist the critic in judging each mode according to its proper ends instead of regarding beauty as a fixed entity. So, what happens? The critic, as we know, as we have already discussed, is judging. And when the critic is judging each mode, it is judging each mode according to its proper ends instead of regarding beauty as a fixed entity. So, instead of thinking of beauty as a fixed entity, these ideas of kind of, idea is that we are not considering anything as fixed. So any beauty or any concept as fixed entity, as ultimate, rather according to its proper ends, according to its, every particular work is analyzed and is judged, and the distinction is established. The ends of tragedy, as Aristotle conceived them, are best served by the harmonious disposition of 6 elements. So he identified different elements in the form of tragedy, and the identified elements are: number 1, plot; number 2, character; number 3, diction; number 4, thought; number 5, spectacle; number 6 is song. So this is how he identifies 6 elements. Now, thanks to Aristotle's insight into universal aspect of audience psychology, many of his dicta have proved to be adaptable to genres developed long after his time. So though he was talking about the literary genres which were available during the time when he was writing, or he was working, or he was alive, yet because of the universal aspects of audience psychology, that is how audiences think, what is their, how their mind works, because of these universal aspects, what happens is that, these ideas, these dictas, these kind of discussions which he has done is applicable to different other genres which have been developed even after he was there no more. Then we come to Aristotle's idea of mimesis. So with Aristotle, the concept of mimesis undergoes a major transformation. It retains the condition of being a copy of a model, but the Platonic denigration is reversed. So the idea of copy is there, but the way Plato had denigrated the idea of copying a model in the form of art, that is reversed. So the reversal is based on metaphysical revision. So the permanent reality is not transcendental in Aristotle's opinion. So when an artist makes an object, he incorporates certain universal elements in it, but he does fall short of any absolute model of universality. Because of the universality contained in art, in Aristotle's view, art, as all other imitation, leads to knowledge. So according to Aristotle, what is happening is that he is viewing the fact that art, though it's an imitation, it is doing what? It is actually leading to knowledge. So art is leading to knowledge. So because of the universality, Aristotle's view of art is that, like other imitations, art leads to knowledge. And since it is leading to knowledge, that is why Aristotle is going against Plato in order to give value to literature, give value to work of art, right? The pleasure that mimesis provides is on account of knowledge that is acquired through mimesis, even though this knowledge is of particulars. So the pleasure that mimesis or imitation provides is an account of knowledge that is acquired, or which is got through mimesis, even though this knowledge is of particulars. So even though the knowledge is of certain particulars, yet it provides some kind of pleasure. So we see that Aristotle's concept of mimesis kind of goes against the, or reverses the idea of Platonic idea of mimesis. So Aristotle's rhetoric. And since learning and admiring are pleasant, all things connected with them must also be pleasant. So since learning and admiring are pleasant, all things connected with them must be pleasant also. For instance, that is, for example, a work of imitation such as painting, sculpture, poetry, and all that is well imitated. Even if the object of imitation is not pleasant, for it is not this that causes pleasure or the reverse, but the inference that the imitation and the object imitated are identical, so that the result is that we learn something. So what is the end result we are looking for? We're looking for the end result that at the end we should learn something. So learning and admiring are pleasant, and all things which are connected with them, they also must be pleasant. For example, a work of imitation such as painting, sculpture, poetry, and all that is well imitated, even if the object of imitation is not pleasant. So the object of imitation might not be pleasant, for it is not this that causes pleasure or the reverse, but the inference that the imitation and the object imitated are identical, are same. That means the imitation is very good, wherein the object and the imitated object, they are the same. And through this, what happens is that we learn something. Since we learn something, that is why it becomes, it gives us some knowledge which makes it very, very helpful, and it gets some kind of very significant value. So with this discussion, we kind of have an understanding of how Aristotle's approach to poetry, to creation, to mimesis is different from that of Plato, and how he restores the value to art which Plato had denied, right? So his theory of imitation and his idea puts back idea of kind of, art as true mimetic form, and the fact that we learn something from it makes it applicable and important to the society. Now we come to Roman criticism and the Roman critics, who also form the part of the origin of literary criticism. So Roman literature and criticism was largely influenced by the views of Aristotle, particularly his views of unities of time, place, and action. Roman writers agreed with the Aristotelian view that the epic should be characterized by a lofty theme, and epic poems like the Aeneid are illustrations of the extent to which Roman writers adhered to the tenets of Greek masterminds. So Aristotle's kind of literary criticism is huge. There are different aspects to it, and it's not possible to actually tie it down to one or two lectures or three lectures, because he talks about so many different things. For example, the unities of time, place, and action, which also influence the Roman critics and Roman literature and criticism. Roman writers agreed with Aristotelian view that the epic, so his views on epic, what should epic be like? So epic should be characterized by a lofty theme, and epic poems like the Aeneid are illustrations of the extent to which Roman writers adhered to the tenets of Greek masterminds. So we see that Roman criticism was born out of the influence of the Greek criticism. In short, drama did have its popularity in Rome, but poetry ultimately proved the most popular and predominant genre The two renowned Roman critics whose critical works are based on poetic creation are Horace and Longinus. So Horace is known for his Ars Poetica, the art of poetry. Longinus is known for his work on the sublime. So Longinus stated that poetry should instill in the reader a sense of awe, that is the sublime, which leads the reader to ecstasy and creates the feeling of exaltation. So it should lead the readers to a feeling of ecstasy, happiness, and a feeling of exaltation, joy. So this is what the idea of or the purpose of a poetry should be like. He felt that one can achieve a sense of sublimity while reading poetry, mainly due to the language and the thought it conveys. So he felt that one can achieve a sense of sublimity or sublime while reading poetry, mainly because or due to the language and the thought it conveys or it expresses. By language, he refers to what? He refers to diction, he refers to imagery, and he refers to figures of speech. Right? So he is stating that poetry should reach or should provide the way to achieve sublimity. And when we are saying sublimity, it is about the idea of getting ecstasy and happiness and exaltation. And it is conveyed mainly through language, wherein language is in the form of diction, the imagery which is used, and the figures of speech which is used. Next, Horace. According to Horace, poetry is an art that needs to be perfected, or rather a subject that needs to be learned. In Ars Poetica, he lifts poetry to a higher realm. So he gives poetry a higher status, a higher realm. According to him, the aim of the poet is not to do what was done before, but to experiment on something new. So what is his idea? According to him, the aim of poet is not to do what was done, but to experiment on something new. So this is what should be the aim of a poet according to Horace. He emphasized on consistency in meter. What is interesting to note is that while Plato focused on literature as a medium of instruction that appeals socially, and Aristotle focused on literature as a medium of delight that appeals psychologically, Horace brought about a harmony of the two by affirming, that is by stating, by supporting the idea, by focusing on that the aim of poetry is to teach and to delight. So what is the aim of poetry? The aim of poetry is to teach and delight. So he brings both together. So what was Plato focusing? Plato was focusing more on literature as a media for instruction. He was talking about didactic purpose of literature. Aristotle focused on what? Focused on literature as a medium of delight that appeals the psychology. And Horace brought about a harmony between these two things, that is instruction and delight. And he states that any piece of poetry should aim to do both. What? Teach and delight. Now, this brings us to the Middle Age critics. And the Middle Age critic whom we are going to study is Sir Philip Sidney. Sidney's Apology of Poetry, or Apology for Poetry, and also known as the Defense of Poesy, or the Apology, which is known as the, you can tell it as Apology for Poetry or the Defense of Poesy, is in many ways a seminal text of literary criticism. So in many ways, it is a very, very important text of literary criticism. It is not only a defense, but also one of the most acclaimed treatises on poetics of its time. So it is one of the most acclaimed treatises on poetics of the time when it was written. Now, Sidney's writing of the Apology as a defense of poetry was occasioned by an attack on poetry entitled The School of Abuse, published in 1579 by a Puritan minister who was the minister Stephen Gosso. So basically, he's thought of writing this work as a defense of poetry because he wanted to write back to somebody who had attacked poetry. Who was that? It was Stephen Gosso, who had attacked the idea of poetry in his work titled The School of Abuse, which was published in 1579. And this work of Sidney comes as an answer to that, to give him the proper answer in order to defend poetry, in order to talk about the significance and importance of poetry. So, as mentioned earlier, Sidney rejects Gosso's Protestant attack on courtly pleasure, effectively defending poetry as a virtuous activity for the aristocracy. So this is the status which he gives to poetry. How is he defending poetry? He's defending poetry as a virtuous activity for the aristocracy. So instead of accepting the views which Gosso states in his The School of Abuse, he talks of or defends poetry as a virtuous activity for the aristocracy. Stephen Gosso's charges, we should know them before we move on to what Sidney answers them, right? So, Stephen Gosso makes charges on poetry which Sidney answers, and the charges are as follows. The first charge is that poetry is the waste of time. Second charge is that poetry is mother of lies. Third is that it is nurse of abuse. And then he supports point number 3 by stating that Plato had rightly banished the poets from his ideal world. So, what are the charges? Poetry is the waste of time. Poetry is the mother of lies. Third, it is the nurse of abuse. So, Stephen Gosso states that Plato had rightly banished the poets from his ideal world. So, he is stating that they had, Plato had rightly banished the poets from his ideal world or from his republic. Against these charges, Sidney has answered them in the following ways. So, Sidney answers that poetry is the source of knowledge and a civilizing force. So, he is saying that we cannot state that poetry has no purpose. Rather, poetry has the purpose of the fact that it is the source. And what kind of source? It is the source of knowledge, and it is a civilizing force because it is civilizing people and sharing knowledge. Gosso attacks on poetry saying that what does it do? It corrupts the people and it is waste of time, as we have just discussed in the previous slide. But Sidney says that no learning is so good as that which teaches and moves to virtue, and that nothing can both teach and amuse so much as poetry does. So Gosso is trying to say that poetry corrupts people and it's waste of time. But Sidney answers back and states that no, poetry teaches something which is termed, or it moves people to something which is virtuous or good action. And it is, it can, that nothing can both teach and amuse as much as the poetry does. So the poetry teaches and amuses. In societies, poetry was the main source of education. So he is stating that the main source of education was poetry. He remembers ancient Greek society that respected poets. The poets are always to be looked up, so poetry is not waste of time. So we see that Sidney is answering to all the charges which were leveled against poetry by Stephen Gosso, and is stating that poetry has a purpose, it makes or turns people virtuous, and hence it is not in any way waste of time. So to the second charge, Sidney answers that poet does not lie because he never affirms that his fiction is true and can never lie. Then the poetic truths are ideal and universal. The poetic truths are ideal and universal. Therefore, poetry cannot be a mother of lies, because the poetic truth, whichever is represented in a piece of work, is ideal and it is universal. So it cannot be the mother of lies. Sidney rejects that poetry is the source of abuses. So, what is the poetry? Poetry is the source of abuses. To him, it is people who abuses poetry, not the vice versa. Abuses are more nursed by philosophy and history than by poetry, by describing battles, bloodshed, violence, etc. On the contrary, that is on opposite, poetry helps maintain morality and peace by avoiding such violence and bloodsheds. So poetry helps in maintaining morality and peace. And how does it do according to Sidney? By avoiding any such picture of violence and bloodshed which is there in philosophy and history. Right? Moreover, it brings light to knowledge. So what does it do? It brings light to knowledge. So poetry helps to maintain morality and peace by avoiding such violence and bloodsheds which is shown in the form of philosophy and history. So he is stating that poetry cannot be mother of all lies because the poetic truths are universal and ideal. Then the fact that it is the source of abuses cannot be accepted because it is not the source of abuses, rather it is, abuses are more nursed by philosophy and history than by poetry, by describing battles, bloodsheds and violence, which is not directly explained by in the poem or poetry. As a result, poetry doesn't evolve as the storehouse or the source of abuses. Moreover, what does poetry do? Poetry brings light to knowledge. Sidney views that Plato in his Republic wanted to banish the abuse of poetry and not the poets. So he wants to correct Goso with the fact that in the Republic, Plato wanted to banish abuse of poetry and not the poets. He himself was not free from poeticality, which can be found in his dialogues. Plato never says that all poets should be banished. He called for banishing only those poets who are inferior. So he identifies the fact that he didn't say that all the poets should be banished, but rather he said that the poets who are inferior and unable to instruct the children or the people who are reading, they should be banished. For Sidney, art is the imitation of nature, but it is not slavish imitation as Plato views. So Sidney states that art is definitely imitation of nature or the things around us, but it is not slavish imitation, which Plato thought. So Plato thought that in the process of imitation, there is no creativity. It is just slavish, just like a slave somebody is imitating. But Sidney says that there is art in this process of imitation as well. Rather, it is creative imitation. What kind of imitation? It is creative imitation. And when this word creative comes in, the idea of imitation evolves. So that imitation is not just for the sake of imitating, but creativity gets added in it. So nature is dull, incomplete, and ugly. It is artists who turn dull nature into golden color. So who is turning dull nature into golden color? The artists. So Sidney gives more power to the act of an artist or a poet, because he is stating that an artist puts or kind of gives a touch of golden color to the dull nature which is lifeless, which lacks life. A golden touch is given to it. So he employs his creative faculty, his imagination and style of presentation to do what? To decorate the raw materials of nature. So the raw materials of the nature are decorated by his creative faculty, his imagination and style of presentation. So these things are employed in order to decorate the raw materials. What are the raw materials? The raw materials are the things which we see around us, and how the poet is actually creating a kind of representation of the things which are seen around us. For Sidney, art is what? Art is a speaking picture having spatio-temporal dimension. So art is a speaking picture which is having some kind of spatio-temporal dimension. As per the space and the time, it has a kind of dimension in it. For Aristotle, human action is more important, but for Sidney, nature is important. So this is the comparison which is there, wherein Aristotle gives more importance to human action and Sidney gives importance to nature. So artists are to create arts considering the level of readers. The only purpose of art is to teach and delight, like the whole tendency of Renaissance. So what is the purpose? Teach and delight. As we saw that Sidney is talking about this. Sidney favors poetic justice that is possible in poets' world, where good are rewarded and wicked people are punished. Plato's philosophy on virtue is worthless at the battlefield, but poet teaches men how to behave under all circumstances. Then comes moral philosophy, teaches virtues through abstract examples, and history teaches virtues through concrete examples, but both are defective. It is poetry which teaches virtue by example as well as by percept, that is blend of abstract and concrete. As a result, poetry is more important, it's more valuable. So the poet creates his own world where he gives only the inspiring things, and thus poetry holds its superior position to that of philosophy and history. So the debate between philosophy, history and poetry is seen to be won by the poets or poetry, because poetry teaches virtue by example as well as by precept, that is blend of abstract and concrete. So these two things are blended, which is not found in philosophy and history. So in the poet's golden world, heroes are ideally presented and evils are corrupt. Didactic effect of a poem depends upon the poet's power to move. Didactic in the sense the way it is preaching a value. It depends on the power a poet has to move, that is to emotionally connect or emotionally affect the readers. It depends upon the effective quality of the poetry, the way poetry affects a person. So among the different forms of poetry like lyric, elegy, satire, comedy, etc., epic is the best form as it portrays what? It portrays heroic deeds and inspires heroic deeds and inspires people to become courageous and patriotic. In this way, Sydney defines all the charges against poetry and stands for the sake of universal and timeless quality of poetry, making us know why the poets are universal genius. So all the points which we discussed is actually, and leading us to this final point of it. What is the final point? The final point is that Sydney defines all the charges which were put against poetry by Stephen Gosso, and he states that poetry stands for the sake of universal, something which is universally accepted, and timeless quality, something which is eternal, timeless quality of poetry, making us know why the poets are universal genius. So all the points which we just discussed, dear students, concludes with this line that finally Sydney is able to establish. Yes, Harshavardhan, good afternoon. I can see your remark there. So yes, so finally Sydney states that poetry is universal, it is timeless, and as a result, the poets can be termed as the universal genius, right? So, with this, we will stop today because you have some other lecture lined up. However, today what we did is that we discussed the origin of literary criticism. We discussed how it originated, what is the idea of criticism, how literary criticism is important, and how did it start. So all these things we have discussed, and finally we discussed about Plato and Aristotle. So with this we will come to the end of today's lecture. I have just stopped sharing my screen because we are towards the end of the lecture. Yes, so you have another lecture lined up after this. So I will not take much of your time here. We have discussed Sydney and some other aspects of Sydney's works we will discuss. So we will be concluding the lecture here. You can see my details on the screen. In between, today we had to stop some of the time, but I think those who were connected could get the idea which we were discussing. You can see my details here. You can see my channel here, wherein you can connect with me afterwards. If you have any topic, anything to discuss right now, you can tell me in the chat box, or else we will call it a day for today. So I have not seen any points here in the chat box right now. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining in. We have discussed the important points, and we will continue with further discussion on literary criticism, which is an important topic for your NetSet English examinations. Thank you so much for joining in. Good evening, and have a good day ahead. Thank you so much.